all sorts of interactions, I should say, between technology and humans. So looking at questions of health, of medical health, in biodiversity, artificial intelligence and citizen science. But today I think we're going to have a particularly interesting discussion about drones with two very fascinating and leading experts in the field. When thinking about drones, I mean, it certainly is an area where there are certainly a number of blurred lines that we're very keen to explore today about where situations are classified as armed conflict and those that aren't through the use of drones. So we're very much looking forward to the discussion. We should be clear that we are filming the event today, so if you're looking to do a question and you're not sure if you want that to go out into the broader world, then maybe keep that in mind. And also if you're in the sort of Twitter sphere and we'd like to contribute to the discussion on Twitter over today, then we're using the hashtag #HumanTech, or one word. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to invite Dr. Alex Leveringhaus to the podium. Alex is a James Martin Fellow in the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict, and he's researching on a project, Military Enhancement Design for Responsibility and Combat Systems. And he's a fantastic member of the school, and I'm looking forward to hearing from him today. So Alex will go first, and then he'll be followed by Dapo, and I'll just introduce Dapo now so that we can continue on. Dapo Akande is the co-director of the Oxford Martin Programme on Human Rights for Future Generations, and he's also in the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict. So Dapo and Alex will both speak for about 20 minutes each, and then we'll open up to questions, and we look forward to the discussion. Over to you, Alex.
Yeah, thanks very much, Natalie, for the kind introduction, and thanks everyone for coming as well to this event, despite the short rainfall outside just a minute ago. It does sometimes deter people, but you all made it, which is great. So I should probably say something about my background. I'm not a technologist by training. I'm a political philosopher, but somehow I've ended up spending a lot of time recently with engineers thinking about the kind of challenges we're seeing in military technologies, in new developments in military technologies, especially in the areas of robotic weapons, drones, automated combat systems, and so on. I also work now on cyber warfare, another big topic of interest, cyber warfare and cyber security. And I'm also getting increasingly interested in the use of biomedical procedures to enhance combatants. So, to cut a long story short, there's a lot going on, it seems to me, in the area of military technology, and it's important that we tackle the kind of legal issues raised by those developments, as well as the philosophical issues raised by those developments. So, before we start with the main presentation, I just want to raise a couple of points about drones, really. That's what I'm going to be speaking on today. So the first point that I want to raise about drones is that drones are not illegal. It's not an illegal weapon at all. It's not illegal under international humanitarian law, international law more generally. And of course, Dapo, as a lawyer, will be able to say more about this. So it's very important to bear in mind that drones are not currently illegal. We are not debating a weapon here or a weapon system here, whatever you want to call it, that would be illegal. I mean, if we did that, I think then the conclusions would be quite clear, and we ban it. We don't want to have anything to do with it, but drones are not currently illegal under international law. The other point that I want to raise is, and this has really come out of a lot of thinking, philosophical thinking, ethical thinking about weapons, is that I don't think drones as such are unethical. Of course, I mean, you can object to weapons as such, to the development of weapons as such. There's an Australian philosopher, John Forge, who's recently written a book out on Springer Academic Press, in which he rejects weapons research for ethical reasons. So he says, no weapons research ever, no new weapons ever, don't develop any weapons. That's a very strong stance to take, and I must say I disagree with this stance. I don't think that drones and many other weapons are, as such, unethical. The American right very often, sort of gun fanatics like to use this phrase, guns don't kill people. And of course, I mean, they're right in saying that. It's very much what is being done with a gun, who uses them for what sort of purposes. So as a philosopher, as an ethicist, I don't think that weapons, many weapons as such, are unethical. It very much depends on the users to which these weapons are put. So again, if I would just say, no, they're completely unethical and I don't like them, there isn't very much to discuss here. So I think that, drones, questions whether they're ethical, but they're at least not unethical. I think that needs to be borne in mind. So they're not illegal, they're not unethical. I also, and that's the last point I just want to raise, I also don't think that drones really raise any fundamentally new issues. I mean, there is sort of a lot of hype surrounding drones, for sure, but I don't think that any of the issues they raise are really fundamentally new. So I hope you're not too disappointed now. I mean, you will come to the lecture and say, yeah, drones, I mean, they're at least not unethical, they're not illegal, and they're not really raising any new issues. Great, what am I going to talk about in the lecture? Well, I think nevertheless that drones do. Please do stay. I think nevertheless that drones do raise important issues. And I also think that drones do probably, or should probably be seen as the symptom of much broader dynamics in contemporary warfare, especially the drive towards remote warfare. I mean, this is in itself nothing new, it has always existed, but it has not necessarily always been taken up in the academic discussion as well. There's actually very little material on this problem of remote warfare. So I think, drones might not be reinventing weapon systems. This might not be something completely unprecedented, but still, there are important issues that we should discuss. So what I want to do is I want to very quickly say something about drones, what drones are. There are actually a lot of systems that can be classified as drones. Then I want to say a little bit about the case for drones, and then I want to say something about the case against drones, and then I want to end with two general points in which I look a little bit at the history of warfare and ask how do drones actually fit into the history of warfare? What are they doing to military institutions? What are they doing to the dynamics of conflict? So let me start by giving this overview. And the first thing I want to say is that drones are here to stay. I think this is pretty clear. And on the picture, of course, you see Philip Hammond, the UK Defence Secretary, and he's in, he's at RAF Wellington up in Lincolnshire, and he's just visiting drone pilots. I think this is the first time, actually, that a minister, a defence minister, has officially visited for a photo opportunity the UK drone pilots. So there's Philip Hammond. It seems to me the UK government is also changing its line on engagement. You see a minister here who coincidentally wrote an article for The Guardian, which accompanied this photo op and said, well, drones are here and I'm behind them. And of course, I mean, there are all sorts of reasons why politicians are doing this, but of course they wouldn't be doing this if this would just be a transitory phenomenon. So drones are very much here to stay. If you followed the news, then you will have also heard, I think a couple of weeks ago, that now the British and the French armed forces are seeking to cooperate when it comes to the development of drone technology. Why, do countries cooperate? Well, they're probably all a bit skint at the moment due to the financial crisis. We're seeing cuts in defense budgets. You want to cooperate. Well, you share the costs. You still want the technology. It shows a commitment that you want a particular type of technology. You're teaming up with other players to get there if you can't do it yourself, if the costs of just developing this would be too high, especially given the current financial situation and the sort of budget constraints that the British Army and many armies around the world are facing. So drones very much here to stay. This is not going away. Now, what is a drone? We use this term drones, and there are actually a variety of systems that could be described as drones. Sometimes the political debate or the public debate is rather confused about these systems. Someone says drones, then someone else comes along and says killer robots, and then you see sort of pictures of the Terminator on the Guardian website, and you just wonder, God, what is going on here? So let me just say something about what drones are in very, very basic terms, and then just give you a couple of examples of actually existing systems that are currently being developed or that are actually currently being deployed. So the first point to note really is that drones come in all shapes and sizes. You can have very small applications, and I show a picture later on of the small applications that can be classified as a drone, as well as aircraft-sized machines. And probably the kind of machines we associate with drones are sort of Reaper drones, Predator drones. They are small aircraft, but there are also smaller systems that can be classified as drones. In addition, due to this, due to the current focus on the war on terror, we are very much concerned with drones that are airborne, basically remote-controlled airplanes. But this is not the only environment in which drones can be used. Drones are not only used in an air environment; they can also be used in a land environment or in a sea environment, and possibly in outer space. So that's important to bear in mind. This is not just something that is occurring in the air forces around the world. These are also developments, sort of a push towards drone technology in other branches of the military across the world. Not only the military, of course, because drones can be used for a variety of purposes. They could be used for surveillance, they could be used by civilian agencies for things like border control. They could be used, in fact, by humanitarian organizations for something like disaster mapping. I gave a talk at Doctors Without Borders a couple of months back, who were looking into using drones, airborne drones, in order to map disaster zones, in order to map refugee camps. So there are humanitarian organizations. I think some are already using them, others are considering using drones. And of course, and that's the most controversial aspect of drone technology, drones can also be used in a military context, namely for the delivery of a payload. That is to say, they are armed and they can be used to apply force, kinetic force, to a target. Now, a further feature of drones is, of course, that they are unmanned, in the sense that there is no operator actually inhabiting the weapons platform. In the case of an armed drone, there's no one, if you imagine a Reaper drone, for example, inside the actual drone flying it. So in that sense, they are unmanned. But still, there is that needs to be stressed, there is a human operator who controls the weapon and who controls the drone, but the drone is controlled remotely. Okay, it is controlled remotely, very often via what one would call teleoperation. The drone is not just controlled remotely, it's teleoperated. That means that the drone has a sensor suite, it can record images, it can transmit images, the operator can see these images, and based upon what he or she sees, he or she can issue a command to the drone via the remote control. I won't be going into this here, but one other feature of drones might very well be that they have certain levels of automation. I think some of the actual weaponized drones do have some automation. They can probably, once programmed, fly to a particular target area, to a particular theater. The operator doesn't have to do that. But once the system is in the vicinity, once it is in the target area, it will switch over again to the operator. I think also that in some drones there is a mode in case the operator loses control of the drone, it will go into kind of an automatically managed descent, or it will just start to circle until control has been regained of the drone. In that sense, of course, you might say that drones do offer a blueprint for some automated weapons or autonomous weapons of the future, but this is very, very far off, and I shan't be saying very much about here. I think there's a different debate to be had about these kinds of systems. So, I mean, bear in mind, the important things are really they are unmanned, they can be used in military context to deliver a payload, and they are remote controlled, even though there are some levels of automation. So this is very much with these currently existing drones that a human operator is making all the decisions. Here you see an illustration of what I just called teleoperation. You see the cockpit of a Reaper, and of course up here you see the screens where the pilot and the weapons officer can see images that the drone records and that the drone transmits, and then they can issue certain commands to the drone, for example, to fire a missile or not fire a missile, so on and so forth. I said drones come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. We can have big drones, we can have small drones. This isn't actually human, this is not a robot, this is not the drone. This tiny thing here in the hand of the soldier, that's the drone. That's the Hornet drone. I mean, despite sort of worries about killer robots and Terminators, it's the small thing that the soldier holds in his hand. That's the drone. It's small, it's remote control, it's called the Hornet, and is usually used by the British Armed Forces in Afghanistan in particular for reconnaissance and for information gathering. Well, it's a fairly small device, as you can see. This drone is, of course, a little bit more notorious. That's the famous Predator drone. Again, here you have a system that has the size of a small aircraft, and you can see the two black Hellfire missiles underneath it. It was initially developed, the Predator drone, for surveillance and reconnaissance missions, but of course it now also carries a payload. And again, you see a very kind of rough picture of how these drones operate. You know, you have a certain data link, you have a satellite link that goes out to the drone. The drone can transmit images and other information via that link, and then the operator in a ground control station can control the drone via the satellite link, of course. So that's really how this idea of teleoperation and remote control works. This is one of the latest drones, one of the latest developments in drone technology. This is Taranis, being developed by BAE Systems. This is a picture of the test flight by Taranis. It was tested by BAE Systems and the RAF in Australia, I think last August in 2013. And I think it was just a couple of weeks ago that BAE Systems and the MOD confirmed the tests in Australia and said that the tests were actually very successful, and that the drone surpassed the kind of expectations that people had towards it. Taranis is an interesting case because it can be automated to a fairly high degree. The drone can track radar stations because of the kind of very distinctive signal these stations emit, and it can, once it has been programmed to do so, attack these radar stations on the basis of the signal it tracks, very roughly speaking. So this might actually be a system that takes the kind of autonomy step or the kind of automation step further. This is the X-47B. It's another drone being extensively tested. So this is the next step, really, in drone technology. Extensively tested by the US Air Force and by the US Navy. It can take off and it can land on an aircraft carrier once it's been programmed to do so, and it doesn't need to be remote controlled to do that. So again, you're seeing here sort of slight increases in automation, certainly for some very difficult sort of flight maneuvers. So this is another very important development. To my knowledge, the X-47B has not been weaponized yet. It does not yet carry the payload. It's a test plane, it's a test drone, first and foremost. But of course, I mean, the step from a non-weaponized system to a weaponized one really is fairly small. Then the last picture I want to show you is an airplane. It is airborne, so this is not staged, and it's an F-16. It's been retrofitted, and it's basically no remote control. And it's, I think, used by the US Air Force for target practice or something. I mean, you can't obviously, for target practice, sort of have a sort of pilot in there who just ejects very quickly once you shoot at it. So it's remote controlled. But of course, you can have existing systems that you can kind of turn into remote controlled weapons if you wish to. So this is also, I think this retrofitting is a very important development. So this is what's happening technologically, really. I mean, there are many other examples as well, but you know, I don't really have time to go through these here. So I'm going to bracket the legal perspective. I'm going to leave Dapo to talk about this. I'm just very quickly going to talk about the ethics of war. I'm going to give some thoughts on the ethics of war. This is ultimately where I come from. I'm a just war theorist. And this is kind of the discourse that I, as an ethicist, work with. And now it would be absolutely futile to try to give you sort of a rundown of just war theory, sort of a nice 2,000-year history in 5 minutes. So I won't attempt to do that. But I think there's sort of a general idea in just war thinking, and that has to do with restricting the use of force and restricting the kinds of reasons that can be given in order to wage war or to use military force. So this is very much a kind of against the view that anything goes. No, just war theorists say no. The use of force really needs to be restricted. I mean, there need to be certain constraints based upon it. And there are really two areas in which this takes place. I mean, the first area has to do with the kind of reasons that can be given to justify the resort to military force, and that usually falls into an area called the jus ad bellum. And here you get criteria like just cause, right intention, proportionality, and so forth, that need to be fulfilled in order for the initiation
of the use of force to be justified. And I'm not going to say very much about this, but this is an area that's obviously also very interesting in this context. The second area has something to do with the justification of force in war once war is underway, and that's commonly classified as the jus in bello in just war theory. So once you've initiated a war, what are you allowed to do? What kind of reasons can you give for the use of force? And again, there's an important restrictions here. I mean, one is the principle of non-combatant immunity, of course, and the other one is the principle of proportionality of means. You're not allowed to do something that would somehow be excessive. And of course, I mean, if you take this into account, then it becomes clear that just war theorists also have an interest in weapons technology, and that we now in just war theory have very interesting debates about weapons. Of course, you get an earlier debate about nuclear weapons in particular. You get the whole field of nuclear ethics, but also now just war theorists are increasingly looking towards drones and towards new military technologies. Obviously, it makes sense to ask for an ethical assessment of these technologies, how they would fare under these specific principles, the principle of discrimination, non-combatant immunity, and proportionality of means. It gives us at least sort of a framework to think about these technologies ethically. So this is kind of my background, really, where I'm coming from here. Now, let me make the ethical case for drones, and then I'm going to make the ethical case against drones. And I leave it really up to you to decide what you think about the technology. As I said in the introduction to my talk, I mean, I don't think it's straightforward. I don't think they're ethically as such. It's a very unethical as such. I think it's a very complex picture for sure. Now, if we go back to these just war principles I just mentioned, especially the jus in bello principles and the principle of discrimination and proportionality of means, then advocates of drones are saying, well, you know, drones are a jolly good idea. We kind of like them because they will ensure better compliance with these two principles. It becomes easier in a way to discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. Non-combatant immunity, that principle can be met more easily with this new technology, and of course they cause less damage than other kinds of systems, than comparable weapons. And usually this pans out in according sort of to two criteria. The first is really precision. It's said that drones, like other precise weapons, other precise weaponry, precision weaponry, causes less damage. And that certainly would fare very well if you look at the proportionality of means principle. A drone is not quite as blunt as other types of weapons. You can stay in a target area. You can very, very closely look at the kind of target. You can make sure everything is kind of in place, that you're complying with the law, and then you can strike. So precision is sort of something that is cited in favor of drones. But of course, precision alone is not enough. So if someone comes along and says, you know, we have lots of precision-guided munitions, you know, lots of precision weaponry, jolly good, well, that's not enough. Of course, I can be very, very precise in taking out a building, and only that building. But if that building is a school, then of course I have a problem, right? So precision in itself is not enough. You also need to think about accuracy. Of course, you can be very, very precise in taking out a particular target, but how can you make sure that it is the right target? And of course, some advocates of drones say, well, you know, it's not just precision. It's actually that the accuracy of the decisions, targeting decisions, will increase with drones. So we have, in the end, kind of better decision making. You can stay in the target area for a long period of time. If you're not sure about what's actually going on the ground, you can defer to another officer. If you're not sure whether what you're doing is legal, well, you can have someone on standby. You're not, you know, like a jet fighter pilot who probably at a very high speed flies into an area, who's sitting somewhere in a cockpit, you know, is restrained by a helmet, can hardly see anything, and then, you know, just shoots at a target. You can stay in the area, you can have a good look around. You can make sure everything is fine before you strike, that what you're doing is okay, it's legal, it's ethical before you strike. So a major advantage, advocates of this technology would say, when one considers precision and accuracy. It's a major advantage of drones, according to other systems. You can stay for long, you can have a good look around. More broadly, you can say, I mean, if you are an optimist, and I'm not sure whether I'm an optimist because I'm a philosopher, but there we go. The rise of drones could reflect something called the humane warfare thesis, which was introduced or formulated by the international relations professor Christopher Koch, who of course teaches at the LSE shortly after Kosovo. Kind of view is things are getting better in terms of warfare, and things are getting better, especially in the Western world. You know, you take extreme care in verifying targets. You ensure compliance with IHL. You know, if push comes to shove, you can have the lawyer in the cockpit. Now, of course, I mean, probably that was a very positive or very premature assessment, but, you know, he might be onto something. So people could very well say, advocates, you know, this is sort of part of a broader picture in which things are actually getting better. You're not just sort of viewing the law as sort of something annoying that you might have to comply with. No, it's kind of built into how your military organization works. And Western militaries in particular have gone very, very far in that respect. You can have the lawyer in the cockpit. And of course, Dapo will say more about the law. I was at a workshop recently, and we were talking sort of a lot about the lawyer in the cockpit. You know, you're on standby, you're flying a drone, you know. You could, of course, transmit these images, you know, to a legal center, to someone else in the military organization. They could provide an assessment. That all sounds jolly good. And then someone said, but would you also like to have a politician in the cockpit with you? And I think the guys from the Royal Air Force who were there were a bit like, we're not entirely sure. We probably just want to stick with the lawyers. So this could really be said in favor of this new technology. Black Hawk down or predator up. You could make an additional case, and such a case has been made, I think, recently by Julian Zavulescu in an edited book on drones, where you say, well, I mean, that's all fair enough, but there's an additional advantage, especially if you're serious about humanitarian intervention or related concepts like the responsibility to protect. I mean, powerful states for all sorts of reasons, and the picture shows victims of the Rwandan genocide up here. And it kind of goes, you know, a lot of powerful states are reluctant to intervene in really, you know, civil wars, in ethnic unrest, and so on. And one reason certainly is that the casualties in non-self-defensive wars are very rarely accepted by politicians and democratic electorates. I mean, that was the famous reason for why the US was very reluctant to do something about Rwanda, because they had experienced Somalia before. And Clinton was very much against at the time, you know, again, sort of having images of American soldiers being shown on TV as they are dragged through the streets of a Rwandan city. So you could say, you know, this is sort of a reason against intervening. We don't want to put the lives of our boys on the line in a non-self-defensive war. But of course, I mean, with this new kind of technology, you could say, well, you know, less wiggle room for states to say no to intervene. You know, you don't necessarily have to risk the lives of your combatants in the defense of foreigners. So you could say, you know, this is an additional argument, probably a humanitarian argument, in favor of these drone systems. So this is something that should also be borne in mind. So you don't have Black Hawk down, you have the Predator up. You can use those sort of new weapons, new capacities. You could probably do much more to prevent mass murder, genocide, ethnic cleansing, and so on. So this is the case for drones, very, very, very roughly speaking. Before I say something about the case against drones, let me very quickly try to address a misunderstanding in the case for drones. Now, the argument in favor of drones does not claim that drones do not cause any non-combatant casualties. I think that is something that's very, very important to bear in mind here. When I read this piece by Philip Hammond in The Guardian on drones, and, you know, why he's behind drones, you can sort of scroll down to see sort of comments by people who say, yeah, that's all right. One of the contributors wrote, but they're still, you know, killing women and children. You know, the claim is not that these drones will, you know, enable people to, or enable militaries to avoid all civilian casualties whatsoever. That is, in my view as a philosopher and ethicist, the main problem with the use of military force, with war, that it will inevitably have an impact on civilian populations. I mean, that is the moral problem. Of course, pacifists could say, well, that's exactly the reason why we don't want to have anything to do with it. But I think the story is slightly more complicated. Drones, you know, any type of precision-guided weapon will not make this moral problem go away. I mean, you can't expect that from one particular type of technology. Rather, the claim that is being made is really, if you look at it, a comparative one. And that is that drones compared to other weapons cause less damage. And this is really the only claim that is being made here. And something like that, you find that in the writings of B.J. Strosser, a very famous article in 2010 in the Journal of Military Ethics. He was also interviewed by The Guardian, I think last year, or so 2 years ago in 2012. They completely misrepresented his views. So, Strosser says something like, if a party or an agent has a morally legitimate goal, and various means at its disposal to accomplish this goal, it should choose the least harmful means to pursue its goal. And then, of course, you can say, that's kind of common sense, really, isn't it? If you have various options to achieve what you want to do, you should always use the least harmful one. And, of course, if you have a morally legitimate goal, and if you think, that drones are less harmful than other means to pursue it, you should kind of employ drones. That's kind of a Strosser, very, very roughly speaking, kind of Strosser type argument. But again, the claim is a comparative one. It's only less harmful, of course. It's not completely without any, unwanted or regrettable side effects that we have these kinds of weapons. So, I think so the criticism, they won't offer zero civilian casualties. That's just not going to work against this technology. That problem is just there, and we somehow need to deal with it. And I won't say about, I won't talk about how philosophers have dealt with it, but it has been addressed quite extensively, of course, in moral philosophy, and I guess also in the law. Now, what could one say against these kinds of weapons? What could we say against drones? And of course, the first case that comes to mind when one talks about the case against drones is really the war on terror here. And that's, of course, how drones have come to prominence. We're partly interested in this development. I think the public is partly aware of this development because of the war on terror. And of course, in the war on terror, they have been used for so-called targeted killings as well as so-called signature strikes. So the idea for the US in particular is not, but I think Israel has also used drones, that you can or you should take out, under certain circumstances, terrorist suspects via the use of force. You should do them, you should kill them, and that you can do this via drones. So this is one of the reasons why drones are used in especially the tribal areas of eastern Pakistan. So it's really the war on terror which has kind of brought up this bigger development and which has sort of giving it in a way some urgency. So it's been used for targeted killings of suspected terrorists as well as so-called signature strikes, where basically you're looking for certain features that people might have. They associate with certain people, they behave in a certain way, they might be carrying weapons and so on, they're behaving suspiciously, and under certain circumstances you might apply force to them. I won't go really into this, I think it's just disastrous. But there we go, targeted killing, signature strikes, that's very much why we are worried about these weapons. Now, you could always say, when you look at this kind of case, at the war on terror, well, is there really anything wrong with those drones as weapons as such, or with the actual targeting policy? If you wanted to go around, I've said this before in a different talk here at the Martin School, to kill people whom you suspect of terrorist activity, you could get James Bond, right? You don't necessarily have to take a drone. So there is this question, is there something really wrong with drones, or is there something wrong with this whole idea of a war on terror, with the whole kind of targeting policy that's underlying it? Of course, then you would have to ask yourself, well, what would be the alternatives? What would happen instead? What would replace those types of policies? And of course, that's a big question. But I think it's not that easy. You can't, I think, just say, well, if it isn't the drone, it's going to be 007 who goes around offing those people. I think there is something about drones that's kind of brought out by this war on terror, which shows that at least they might accelerate certain dynamics in contemporary conflict. One issue which I guess Dapo is going to mention is the unconventional uses of weapons, and especially the uses of weapons like, for example, drones outside of an international armed conflict, which is again sort of a legal conception, of course. That's something that's with us, and that's something that seems to be accelerating, at least with the use of drones. We also, I guess if you think again about this issue of precision, of accuracy, we're seeing an increasing individualization of warfare. If you look at targeted killings, we can compile dossiers on you. We can do a lot of intelligence work on you. You as a person, before we take you out, before we do something to you, think about how different this is from, say World War II, where you saw mass bombardment. Think about Vietnam, bombardment of Vietnam. There's really no individualization of warfare there. This is kind of very, very different. And of course, the kind of technology that you have on offer might sort of just accelerate or aid those kinds of dynamics. Think also about asymmetrical responses. That's what we've seen. We've seen this in the counterinsurgency operations that the US has fought, and the British and, of course, the Germans have fought in Afghanistan, and also, of course, in Iraq. What do you do if you really confronted with an enemy who's very technologically superior to you? Well, you kind of, you don't, take him on the battlefield openly. Rather, you respond asymmetrically. And let me put this differently, very, very bluntly. You won't be able to get at the drone pilot. The drone pilot might be thousands of miles away. You could fight all these machines, but what effect is this going to have? It might be much easier to go into a McDonald's and blow yourself up. So there are these kinds of issues that do arise from the use of drones. And I think one can't simply discard them and say, well, it would just be James Bond. Let's not worry about these drones. They don't raise any problematic issues at all. I think they do have very much an impact of what we think about conflict and some of the problems we associate with contemporary conflicts: unconventional use, individualization, asymmetrical responses. The other problem, probably here, I'm more philosophical in my assessment. Another problem would really be what I consider the problem of combatant liability. Why should someone be classified as a combatant? And why should it be okay, or at least permissible, to kill such a person? And this is really, I think, a general problem for what we see with drones, and especially with the acceleration of remote warfare. Now, of course, lawyers will have all sorts of reasons why certain people are classified as combatants, but philosophers have also done some work on this very question. And one answer has been, well, combatants are combatants, and, they may be killed, or it's permissible to kill them under certain circumstances because they're dangerous. These are guys who are walking around with guns who have been trained to kill. They're going to come after you. And Michael Walzer, very famous just war theorist, very famous American social philosopher, once said, these soldiers, combatants, are men who are dangerous. They have been turned into dangerous men by the state. They pose a threat to you. Now, what does this mean, really, with remote and with drone warfare? Why should it be permissible to kill people if they're not necessarily posing a direct threat? There can be very, very different threats. There can be different degrees of threats. I think the image that someone like Walzer has in mind is really an image, where you have a soldier in a trench, he could be reached by the enemy's machine gun, the enemy is, in a way, posing a threat. It's a very, very direct threat here, and as a result, the soldier is allowed to kill the enemy. Of course, we don't see this with drones. The operator of a drone might be thousands of miles away. So why should it be permissible to kill, a combatant in a particular theater? Of course, there's one sense in which it is permissible. Imagine you have a group of British soldiers who comes under attack from the Taliban in Afghanistan during a mission in Afghanistan and calls for air support. Now, in this kind of case, it doesn't really seem to matter at all whether you use an Apache helicopter or an F-16 or a drone in order to give that sort of air support to the soldiers who've come under fire here. But of course, there will be other circumstances where the kind of threat that individual combatants pose will be not that apparent at all. So, why should it be permissible to kill them? Morally permissible, at least, to kill them. What does it mean in this new world of warfare where you can target over long distances, where you have these precision guided weapons? What does it really mean to pose a threat, which would, in the end, at least morally, probably justify killing? So that's something definitely to consider. My last main argument against, and this is something, again, not particularly aimed at drones, has to do with the whole question of peace. And just war theory generally assumes that, war is an awful thing. Don't read just war theory as trying to justify war or thinking that it is sort of a nice thing that is that is somehow desirable. It does not think that. Just war theory very much assumes that war is an evil. Usually acts take place in war, the killing, large-scale killing of individuals that we would reject under normal circumstances, that we would reject in normal society. What just war theorists say is it is a lesser evil. right? Compared to untrammeled aggression, compared to genocide, war, or the use of military force might sometimes be a lesser evil. And that, of course, means that the kind of goods that you're trying to protect via the use of force need to be very important. It seems to me one of the very few goods that comes to mind here is, of course, peace. And in fact, I mean, that's what a lot of just war theorists say. They would place the use of force in this broader framework of having to bring about peace. Military force is not an end in itself. It cannot be an end in itself. Somehow it has to be related to peace. And of course, I mean, this is something that is, fairly problematic if we're looking at these increases in remoteness. It's very, very clear that, just taking out the bad guys, what we're seeing at the moment is targeted killings, for example, by the US, is not enough to build peace. Peace building is a longer process. It does require efforts. I can't see very much in terms of a peace building strategy in Yemen. I can't see very much in terms of a peace-building strategy in eastern Pakistan. I mean, look at what happened in Libya. I mean, there wasn't, and compare this to what happened before in ex-Yugoslavia, with the reconstruction of Bosnia, with the reconstruction of Kosovo, the internationalization of territories, all those kinds of things. And then look at what happened in Libya. Not very much that would be sort of comparable to those sorts of events that had roughly taken place a decade before. What is happening to peace here? How can you create peace if you're increasingly relying on these sorts of remote weapons? I think that's a very important question that we have to ask. Now, I want to finish off by talking very briefly about two sort of historical points, and just very, very briefly. You see two pictures here. Of course, one is from a Lancaster bomber, and you see a bomb aimer in the Lancaster bomber, and you see here drone pilots in the cockpit of a Predator, the battle control station of a Predator. And of course, I mean, in a way, these kinds of pictures look fairly similar. But there are, of course, big differences here. Being a British pilot in the Royal Air Force during World War II, that was one of the most dangerous, or generally being in a Lancaster bomber, flying missions over continental Europe, flying missions over Germany, was one of the most dangerous things you could do. Getting into the bloody plane was one of the most dangerous things you could do. How many airmen did not come back afterwards? 44,000? 55,000 airmen did not come back after this. Incredibly dangerous. Now, that, of course, will inform how you view yourself. And if you look at the Royal Air Force, there's always been a certain self-understanding of soldiers, of pilots, that you put yourself in danger somehow. That's part of the job. That's part of the ethos. How is this going to change? How is this going to change once we get these new kinds of systems? What is going to happen here? How is the self-understanding of combatants, how is the self-understanding of soldiers who are using this kind of technology going to change? And I think militaries, if they want to have sound policy options in place, need to respond to this point. This is not really a legal point, it's not really an ethical point, but nevertheless well worth raising. My last slide, and I think we need to come back to this, has to do with, of course, World War I. I think you can't give a talk about the use of force. You can't talk about this, especially this year, without at least mentioning World War I, of course. And on the left-hand side, you see a picture of German and British soldiers during the famous Christmas truce of 1914, where fighting stopped. And, the soldiers did exchange cigarettes and chocolates, and they even played a football match together. And there was sort of the idea, we're all in the same boat, we're all fighting this war. We are somehow, all of us are equal. We are all in the same mess, really. Here, of course, you're looking at something very different, namely the shot from a drone. And of course, there is no sense that all the people here are in the same boat, really. And it's a very different situation from the kind of German and British soldiers we're seeing here. And I'm wondering, what really happens to warfare if the kind of risks, if the victimization of that war kind of inevitably throws up is just imposed on one group of people, and other people are just almost completely protected from that? What is happening to warfare here? And that's something that needs to be answered. And the critical question which I want to finish is, if war is really so awful that you need to go to extraordinary lengths to protect your service personnel, trained soldiers, that you need drones, other remote weaponry, if it's really so awful that you can't expose people to these risks, what kind of justification do we have of imposing those risks on others? And I think that's something we should bear in mind. Thank you very much.
I was very worried when Alex started, because he started in what I would regard as an unconventional fashion. He gave all the goods away right at the beginning. Drones, not unethical, not illegal, and just as he said that, the sun started to shine outside. I thought, what reason do they have to stay now? They can go back outside, you've told them the story, but I'm glad you decided to stay. So I will talk very much from the legal perspective. What I really want to ask is a very similar question to the question that Alex has been asking, and the question is, what's so bad about drones? So let's try to identify precisely what this controversy is about. We've seen a lot of controversy in the media, we've seen a lot of controversy in relation to policy making in relation to drones. In October last year, towards the end of October, 2 United Nations special rapporteurs, in what I think was a coordinated effort, issued separate reports on drones to the UN General Assembly. In the same week, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch also released reports on drones. And all 4 of these reports were trying to highlight a set of issues relating to the controversy relating to drones. But what is the precise problem? Now, one may take the view that the problem is the technology. So one may say, well, this technology allows for the greater use of force in the sense that it desensitizes those using force to the consequences of their actions. So very much the sorts of things that Alex was talking about right at the end there. That the technology is particularly harrowing for the population that's subjected to the use of force because there's no one to fight against. And that may lead to the sort of consequences that Alex was highlighting. You know, maybe easier to go and blow yourself up in McDonald's if you can't fight against these machines. So is the problem the technology? And the fact that this technology perhaps leads us to a greater use of force and imposes the risks on another population. Secondly, we may take the view that drone warfare leads to unacceptable civilian casualties. So that's our problem, we may say. It's about the civilian casualties of drone warfare. And if you look at the reports that NGOs tend to issue relating to drones, so the Human Rights Watch report I referred to, the Amnesty International report that I referred to, that's what they tend to focus on. They focus on the civilian casualties caused by drone warfare. The Bureau for Investigative Journalism has a fantastic website where they try to detail the casualties of drone warfare. And Alex has talked a little bit about that, and I'll return to that. The third thing we may be concerned about are the practices associated with drone warfare. So not the technology as such, not the civilian casualties as such, but really the practices that drone warfare allows us to engage in. So this is the targeted killings and signature strikes that Alex was talking about. The individualization of war that he was referring to. We may say, well, this is the problem. And in the context of, in particular, the US's use of drones in Pakistan, in Yemen, to some extent in Somalia, but principally actually in Pakistan, there's been a lot of discussion around these issues of how do we characterize the legitimate targets of drones. So who is a civilian who may be targeted, who may not be targeted, sorry, who is a combatant, who is a legitimate target. And in the 2 reports by the UN Special Rapporteurs in October, they focused on some of these legal questions of definition. Alex and I should say, actually worked with one of the UN Special Rapporteurs, the one on extrajudicial killings, in the course of developing and writing that report. Now, Alex has already answered some of these questions in relation to what the problem is, or at least he's given an indication of these issues. So if we start, first of all, with the second suggestion, that it's about the civilian casualties, there's a very easy response, which Alex talked about, which is to say, well, actually, drones are more precise. They're more accurate than other weapons platforms, and that maybe that is not our problem, precise and accurate in the ways that he described. on the technology front, we may say, well, it's true that drones might lead to a desensitization of those who are using force, and that they allow for a greater use of force. But we might say, well, maybe that's not really the biggest issue here. That's not really the biggest issue, because in the main, drones have been used in asymmetric warfare. And it's unlikely that we're going to see extensive use of drones in conflicts between states, because you need, or at least conflicts between states that are similarly situated, because you need a certain degree of control of the airspace, which you may not have, right? So yes, it desensitizes us to using force, but there are certain limitations as well which the technology has, which might mean that this is not perhaps as big a concern as we might otherwise think about. What about the third issue, the practices associated with drone warfare, targeted killing, signature strikes? So these are those issues around the definition of a combatant, right? So in relation to targeted killings, one of the main things that we need to work out is who is a legitimate target and who is not. In what circumstances can you actually target an individual, even if that individual is a legitimate target? But these are general questions relating to the law of armed conflict. They are general questions relating to the ethics of war. And these questions will remain even if we did not have drones. And in some respects, maybe these questions would be even sharper if we did not have drones, because we'd be using weaponry that's perhaps more indiscriminate. And so though these are problematic in relation to drones, they're no more problematic than the problems we would otherwise face. To my mind, the single biggest issue with regard to drone warfare is actually some of the issues that Alex had on the last slide there. The fact that it tends to blur the dividing line between war and peace. To my mind, that's the single biggest issue in relation to drone warfare. It blurs the line between the framework that we have, the framework of law as a lawyer, and also the ethical framework that we think about in the context of peaceful situations, and the framework that we think ought to apply in the framework of war and armed conflict. Now, when we think about the practices associated with drones, the biggest controversy is really about this question of targeted killings and signature strikes, as Alex described, so where you target an individual not based on knowing that particular individual, but based on certain characteristics or defining features of that individual. But when we think about targeted killings, whether or not targeted killings is seen as a problem or should be seen as a problem depends very much on whether we think we're operating in time of peace or whether we're operating in time of war, whether this is an armed conflict or not an armed conflict. Because we have very different legal standards and ethical standards with respect to targeting, which depend on whether we're operating in time of peace or whether we're operating in time of war. So in time of armed conflict, international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict, says you can target a person based on their status. It's not necessarily about what that person is doing, but it's about the status of that person. So if the person is a member of the armed forces, that person is a combatant, and the law of war or international humanitarian law says that person is a legitimate target. Of course, you can also target based on their conduct, but it's permissible to target based on status. In time of armed conflict, international humanitarian law says you don't necessarily have to use the least restrictive means to take this person out. So maybe this is the difference between the ethics and the laws of war. There's a debate in IHL about this, but I think most people take the view that if a person is a combatant, they are a legitimate target. And even if you can capture this person, it is lawful to target that person. Right? So even if you can actually capture, it would be lawful to target because the person is a combatant. That's the framework during armed conflict. In times of peace, we would regard these principles as inapplicable. So human rights law would require that a person can only be targeted based on activity that they are carrying out at that point in time of peace. We would say, if we think about the police we think about law enforcement, we would say that a person can only be subjected to the use of lethal force if that is absolutely necessary to respond to an immediate threat which is sufficiently serious at that point in time. We would say this person has to be posing a threat to the life of others or a similarly serious threat. And we would say in time of peace that the targeting, the use of lethal force, has to be the least restrictive means. In other words, we would not accept that a police officer who has the opportunity to arrest or detain somebody who poses even a very severe threat is allowed to shoot that person if they had a lesser means of targeting that person. So you can see we have very different frameworks that apply depending on whether we're thinking about peacetime or whether we're thinking about an armed conflict. And so if we return to the question of targeted killings and we try to work out whether this is a problem or not a problem, if it's in time of armed conflict, targeted killing is not only not a problem, in many respects it is desirable. It is precisely what we want in time of armed conflict. So Alex referred to the individualization of war. In time of war, we would say, well, the laws of war, IHL, prohibits indiscriminate targeting. It is prohibited. It's a war crime to have indiscriminate targeting. What we would wish in time of war is to see that, A, only combatants can be the object of an attack, and to restrict attacks which are, and prevent attacks which are disproportionate in their effects. In other words, we want as much as possible the attack to be as focused on legitimate targets as possible. So that takes you actually down the line where you say, well, to the extent that we can identify who is a legitimate combatant, we want the attacks to be restricted to them. So targeted killing would not be a problem. Of course, if you take that same practice and you apply that practice in time of peace, targeted killing becomes extrajudicial killing. It becomes application of the death penalty by the state without the constraints that would otherwise apply in terms of judicial safeguards. So though you might have the lawyer in the cockpit, we would say, no, we don't want a lawyer in the cockpit. You know, if the state is going to kill at all, we actually want there to be more stringent standards than that. So the key question, to my mind, in relation to drone warfare is whether or not we're operating in time of peace or in time of armed conflict. Now, why is this a significant issue in relation to drones? Well, the reason that this is a significant issue in relation to drones is that the technology allows for relatively low-level uses of force over a period of time, over perhaps an indeterminate period of time. So force can be used sporadically for a very long period, such that we're unsure as to whether we're in war or whether we're in peace. And the problem is that the framework of international humanitarian law is one which we regard as acceptable because we think it applies in exceptional times. So, and the same is true for just war theory as a matter of ethics and philosophy. Alex's point at the end there, that it's not about justifying war, but it's accepting that there might be exceptional situations where this practice is legitimate. Well, the challenge of drones is that it turns what we would otherwise regard as exceptional situations possibly into the new normal. And if we think that this framework of the law of armed conflict is the applicable framework to that set of practice relating to drones and targeted killings, then what we have is the application of a framework designed for exceptional periods of time into what you might otherwise regard as the normal period, indefinitely. And that is the big challenge. So, how do we try to think about this? How does the law try to think about whether or not we're operating in time of peace or whether we're operating in time of armed conflict? As a matter of international law, there are three possible scenarios that we can think about when we think of situations of violence. So we can classify situations of violence as a matter of law into three three scenarios. First of all, we have international armed conflicts, which simply put means armed conflicts between states. Secondly, we have non-international armed conflicts, which are conflicts between a state and a non-state entity. And then we have other situations of violence which would fall below the threshold. So a riot or some other disturbance where we say, yes, there's violence, but it's not an armed conflict, and so our normal paradigm of human rights law continues to apply. And it would only be in the first two situations, international or non-international armed conflicts, that we actually change our paradigm, and we think that these exceptional principles apply. Because, as I mentioned earlier on, drones are principally used in the context of a non-international armed conflict, principally, but not exclusively, because drones were used in Libya, which would classify as an international armed conflict, but principally in a non-international armed conflict. The key question is trying to work out what qualifies as an armed conflict, a non-international armed conflict between a state and a non-state group. And in the context of the war on terror, which Alex was talking about earlier on, what qualifies as a non-international armed conflict between, say, a state like the US and a group like Al-Qaeda, whatever it might be, and to what extent can this non-international armed conflict take place on a global basis? Now, it's interesting when one thinks about the controversy regarding drones to think about the scenarios where the controversy has mainly arisen. So as far as I'm aware, drones have been used, are being used by three states principally. It's mainly the US, Israel, the UK, as far as I'm aware, so far anyway. And drones have mainly been used, let me think about this, I think in 4 countries, if I'm correct. So Pakistan, Yemen, 5. Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, occupied Palestinian territories, and Libya. So 5 situations, as far as I'm aware. Now, most of the controversy has centered around Pakistan, to some extent Yemen, maybe to some extent Somalia. Not a great deal of controversy to my mind, to my knowledge, about the use of drones in Afghanistan, nor to my knowledge has there been a great degree of controversy regarding the use in Libya. That actually matches with the concern that I've just expressed, because in Afghanistan and in Libya, there was an acceptance that this is an armed conflict. There's very little dispute that this is, or this was in the case of Libya, a situation of war, of armed conflict. Whereas in Pakistan, to some degree in Yemen, in Somalia, the worry is, well, are we introducing drones into a scenario where, take the drones out of it, we don't think that there's an armed conflict? I'm sorry, that's me. Take the drones out of it, we don't think that there is an armed conflict. So the key question is this question of how do we decide on what is a non-international armed conflict between a state and a non-state group? And essentially, international humanitarian law sets out 2 criteria. You need a degree of intensity of violence between the contending parties, and then the armed group has to be sufficiently organized for us to say that this is actually an armed conflict. The critical question in relation to the war on terror is this question of geography. Can you have a non-international armed conflict that extends across several territories, across the globe almost, so that we say, well, the US is involved with an armed conflict with Al-Qaeda, because there are various activities taking place all around the globe, and when we add them together, the intensity of violence is such that we would think of it as if it was an armed conflict. The problem here is that when one thinks about the so-called global war on terror, as it used to be called, and this requirement of the group has to be sufficiently organized, in relation to the war on terror, the question is Al-Qaeda, whatever it might be, in this global context, a single organized group that we can think of in the ways that we would normally think of an organized group in something like a civil war? And much of the legal analysis focuses on that question. Is it one group which is sufficiently organized so that we can aggregate all the violence that is allegedly committed by Al-Qaeda into this one organization? Or should we really be thinking about them as separate organizations, such that what happens in Pakistan in relation to the Pakistani Taliban, it's just about that sphere? And within that sphere, maybe we say, actually, no, we don't think that this rises to the level of an armed conflict, because in Pakistan, the level of violence, I mean, as between the US and the Pakistani Taliban, is actually, relatively speaking, low. Almost everything depends on whether we can aggregate all this violence under this umbrella of Al-Qaeda and then say, you put it all together, this rises to the level of something that we can think of as an armed conflict. Maybe I should stop there so that we can have some time for question and answer.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much, Dapo and Alex, for two fascinating discussions. Perhaps if Alex joins us up here and we'll go to questions. Obviously, we had some stimulating discussion there. We want to have as many questions as possible. We were unable to organise a drone to help carry the microphone around, but we have lovely Julian here to help us. So those with questions, let's have a show of hands. We'll take a couple and then we'll do them in rounds if that's okay with you guys.
Yeah.
Gentlemen here. And the lady in front. Any other questions just for a show of hands? And just to the
Thank you very much. Mr. Akande, since you were talking from the law perspective, I would like to know, was it deliberately that you missed out the case of sovereignty? Is that issue not there, number one? Number two would be the preemptive strikes. Are we admitting that, yes, preemptive strike is acceptable, is already a jus cogent, and so we are moving forward? Thank you.
Thank you for your talks. What of the role of the military-industrial complex in this drone saga? And in practice, does just war considerations and morality and ethics, or the bottom line, actually guide our thinking about the use of force and drones? Thank you.
So I'm curious about the role of drones as surveillance tools in wars, because they're also kind of automatically self-documenting to an extent which normal soldiers are not. Soldiers might perhaps record what we're doing, but drones are almost built with it. And it's probably going to be an awful lot of videotapes that are actually going to document every intervention. That seems like it could actually be a very strong argument in favor of drones if one could make sure that those documentation of any strikes would then get to the right legal authorities.
Should I take the first question first? So the question relating to sovereignty and preemptive strikes, these are significant issues relating to whenever a state uses force abroad on the territory of another state. The reason I didn't focus on them is that these questions would arise whether or not you use drones or some other use of force. So these are significant questions. Should we allow preemptive strikes? These are big questions. But I was trying to isolate the questions that are particular to drones. You'd have those same questions even if you weren't using drones as your platform. I'm sure Alex will have something to say about some of these questions as well. Military-industrial complex, I don't know.
Well, I mean, 2 points on that, and it is a good question, right? 2 points on that. The first point is that a lot of people say that drones are cheap. They're much cheaper to operate than, say, conventional jet fighters and so on. That's not true. That's absolutely not true. You have to kind of build up the capacity in the first place. You have to buy these new systems. You have to train stuff. I don't know, is it 120 people that are actually involved in getting a Predator drone up into the air? So I don't think they're necessarily going to be cheaper or more cost effective. Certainly the defense industry is interested in developing these drones and selling them. That's certainly true. However, I would say that it's not only the bottom line that decides here. Of course, these are considerations. We shouldn't kid ourselves. But there are really 2 points. I mean, one is that generally, or at least the military personnel I've talked to, are very concerned about the law. The law does play an important role in warfare. One can't deny that. And that might sort of intersect with the humane warfare thesis that I mentioned. You know, the law is now part of warfare. The other point which we should not disregard is, and this was a point actually that was raised by Christopher Coker in a couple of weeks ago in this very same building here, is that nowadays we have the most highly educated soldiers we've ever had. We have a lot of ethics training in military academies. We have, people like Michael Walzer, other people, probably less prominent, who go into these military training academies, who talk to soldiers. So to just sort of say, it's all about the money and the bottom line sides, I don't think that's the case. I mean, that's probably sort of an activist argument against this kind of technology. I think it's much more complex. The law comes in it. There is certainly a much greater ethical awareness nowadays than it was sort of 10, probably even 10, 15 years ago. So I don't think the kind of bottom line only argument would work. Very quickly on Anders' point, yes, I mean, I think this is actually a very interesting issue. It's of course not just restricted to drones as such. I mean, you might consider, for example, so-called autonomous systems that might document very, very clearly as to what they do. So you get a black box and you can kind of replay actually what's happened. But you also, of course, now get helmet cameras with soldiers. So it might actually be that soldiers themselves are capable of documenting a particular scenarios. And of course, I mean, that might be desirable if you're thinking about prosecutions for war crimes and so on and so forth, or even just analysis of what happened, a debriefing. And so yes, I mean, it seems to me more documentation is actually something that's desirable, also from the standpoint of the law.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, that of course this is an inherent feature of drones, but with other weapons platforms, it could also be an inherent feature. So fighter jets very often as well, you have cameras, as he says, even with soldiers, Mobile phones, let's not forget, mobile phones, So the recent prosecution that we had in this country about the Marines in Afghanistan, that was something filmed on mobile phones. So it doesn't even have to be high tech to have that. But you're right, that of course with the drones, it's inbuilt.
Great, thank you, Dapo and Anders. Let's go for another round of questions. Can I just get a show of hands? Gentlemen here at the front, at the back there, Julian will...
I was interested in the legal status of the drone operators, because currently there's the dispute between the U.S. and Afghanistan over the status of forces agreement about legal immunity for U.S. forces in Afghanistan. If no status of forces agreement is set between the U.S. and Afghanistan, and the U.S. continues to operate drones, are the operators that are sitting in Las Vegas, could they be sued by Afghanistan, given that they're not on sovereign territory, but their actions are affecting things that happen within the borders of a different country?
Thank you. Thank you for 2 fascinating chats. My contention is that there's nothing new here. That the blur is not between drones and the law or ethics. It's actually the continuous analysis of targeting and the proportionality of the use of force. And so it's almost erroneous to sort of blur drones into this discussion. So my question is whether the canon of law is adequate, and it's all about interpretation. And secondly, about this sort of the fine edge of policy, which is the sort of the constraint that is enabled by the impunity of the system, the opportunity that it might find targets, and proportionality of the use of its weapon systems. So that is the law adequate, first point. Secondly, is in fact this not really about a debate about the effective and legal targeting, not really about drones at all?
Great.
Yeah. So,
take the law
So on the first question about the legal status of drone operators, that's a good question. There's actually been a case in this country, in the High Court, in this country, and in the Court of Appeal, actually, very recently, the Court of Appeal gave its decision relating to this issue of the legal status of drone operators. And in the case, the essential contention of the group that was bringing the case was that because drone operators were not part of the military, they are therefore unlawful combatants, and that it is a war crime for the UK to assist the US in
engaging in acts which would be war crimes. And the essential contention is that it's a war crime because the drone operators are not combatants, which is not, the case was dismissed by the Court of Appeal. It's not actually quite accurate. So it is right to say that to be a lawful combatant, you need to be a member of the regular armed forces. So that is correct to say. But it's not correct to say that it is therefore a war crime for somebody who's not a member of the armed forces to take part in hostilities. What is important, though, and this is where your question goes, is whether or not a person who is not a member of the armed forces has what we describe as combatants immunity, right? So combatants, lawful combatants, if you like, are immune from prosecution from lawful acts of war. So they may not be prosecuted for things that do not amount to war crimes. And so if you're not a combatant, you don't have that immunity. And so the key question in relation to drones is, well, if this person is not a lawful combatant, can they be prosecuted? To which the answer is yes. Of course, in practical terms, the question is, how would you get this person? You know, this person sitting out in Nevada, maybe if they go on holiday to Pakistan or something like that, they could be prosecuted. But it's not going to, I actually don't think it's as big an issue as people make out. Because it's not a war crime, it's just an issue of whether they can be prosecuted and are you actually going to be able to prosecute them? On the question about whether it's about proportionality or not, so, I mean, this goes to what I was trying to say, that I share some of that view, that some of these debates are debates which would exist even if we didn't have drones. So they are debates about who is a combatant, who is a legitimate target. There are debates about when can you actually target somebody. Can you do it at a funeral, as the US is alleged to have done? Can you do it for rescuers? So the practice whereby it said that the drones will target a particular building, and then a while later, when rescuers have gone in, another drone will come back and then target that same building, right? So this is what the Bureau of Investigative Journalism has said. Now, that debate, I think you're right, is not a debate about drones as such. It's a debate about a particular targeting practice. I think that's correct, and those debates will still be there. But I think drones does introduce this new element of long-term warfare, which is almost mixed with peace, such that we're not sure whether we're in peacetime or warfare. I think that will only really happen with drones. With other technology, it's unlikely that we will see that kind of sustained, low-level, sporadic, but almost indefinite use of force. I think that is unique to drones, I think, or almost unique.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we would have these debates anyway, and drones might just be a symptom, as I said during the talk, of the kind of dynamics we're seeing in conflict. I'm just thinking of Michael Ignatieff's observations about the Kosovo campaign, his book Virtual War, which came out in 2000 as a reaction to it, and who already identified this problem. Most of the NATO troops during Kosovo, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but he said, most of the NATO troops during the Kosovo war did the fighting, but only the people on the other side did the dying. What happens here? This is already a problem that exists, and I think sort of drones and more generally the development of remote technologies, they kind of really bring this problem to the fore. But just very, very briefly, I think on the drone issue, what is distinctive here? You have a distinctive element in a sense that the remoteness is really almost increased to an absolute degree. And that, it seems to me, will have considerable impact on how the military views itself and how professional soldiers within the military view themselves. It's not, probably, we're talking about future trends here as well. It might not necessarily be anymore about being in actual theaters, in actual combat situations, but rather about working with these kinds of remote technologies. And I think, the military needs to think about how to manage this particular type of change. And lastly, of course, just war theory and just war thinking has always been shaped
by war itself as a practice. You know, the account that you find in medieval just war theory is very much, of course, you know, informed by medieval forms of warfare. Modernity, again, a huge step of how our thinking is always kind of caught up and has been shaped by historical developments. And of course, with these new developments, some of which, you know, Dapo alluded to in his talk also, kind of this blurring between peace and war, you know, what kind of a situation is it? How do we classify it legally? New remote capacities, almost an absolute distancing from the actual battlefield. What does this do to our thinking? And is the kind of ethical framework that, in my view at least, is very, very heavily shaped still by World War I and World War II, if one looks at people like Michael Walters and others, is that really adequate to deal with those sorts of issues? So I think, yes, let's leave drones in there. I think they do raise important issues, but we would still be discussing some of these issues anyway.
Great, I think we'll just do one more round of questions. The gentleman here, the lady here, and the gentleman here.
Got a couple of questions for Alex. I was really interested by that picture of the retrofitted F-16. I was wondering how widespread retrofitting is currently, how widespread do you think it might become, and whether there's any ethical difference between a retrofitted jet and a drone?
Ooh, I mean, that's a difficult question here. I mean, as far as I'm aware, the retrofitting is literally just used for target practice. But it is a possibility, and it might just be very well the case that this is further developed and further exploited. And it seems to me, I mean, in terms of his strike capacities, you can do much more with a fighter jet, with a sort of proper big fighter jet, than probably a drone. So I think, you know, this retrofitting is going to take place, and I think it's going to be increased. Is there going to be a big difference, well, between sort of the kind of drones we have in retrofitted weaponry? I mean, I don't think so. I mean, we still have this problem of remoteness. There are remote control. They're probably just more sophisticated or less sophisticated than some drones. So I don't think the retrofitting as such makes a big ethical difference here. But I think this is very well sort of a trend that we should be aware of.
May I come last? Just a short question. This is a comment, not a question.
Very short.
This is very quite controversial. I don't know. I'm looking at, I am here because I looked at the last part of the title, 21st Century Warfare. 21st Century Warfare has not just the latest technology, drones. It may be there in some parts of the world, but in some parts of the world, 21st century warfare includes 19th century technology. For example, just last week in Sri Lanka, the northern part, which is highly militarized, and in that country, textbooks are given freely to school kids. But the president's son has been going to that area to issue the textbooks with his pictures and his father's pictures pasted on the textbooks. So this is also 21st century warfare.
I mean, I think absolutely. I mean, we've just been talking about one dynamic in 21st century warfare. I don't think what we talked about exists everything that's out there. It's one aspect, an important aspect which we talked about, but it's limited.
And just this gentleman.
Thank you for this fascinating lectures. I don't know if you have enough background information on the about the impact of nuclear wars, nuclear weapons on modern policy making and strategy making. But I mean, I wonder if you could compare the impact of nuclear weapons on modern policy making and strategic making, and the impact of drone warfare. I mean, this could be an early question, but what about your predictions? I mean, similarities, differences, speculation, maybe a little bit.
I mean, the relationship between nuclear weapons and drones. I mean, I'm not really sure. We would have to ask an expert on nuclear weapons. But I think that there's, in a way, one difference. I mean, one is this whole issue of deterrence. And of course, you have nuclear weapons. I mean, there's at least just one justification, which is you want to deter other people, from sort of doing bad things. The question is whether these remote kind of capabilities that are being built up could potentially have, a similar deterrent effect.
Of course, I mean, the deterrence in nuclear weapons partly, does stem from their indiscriminate nature. And, as I said at the outset, they're not necessarily unethical drones. They're not necessarily illegal. They're not necessarily indiscriminate. So very different from a nuclear weapon. Of course, I mean, could you deliver a nuclear weapon with a remote-controlled airplane or a remote-controlled underwater vehicle? I'm not sure whether that's possible. I'm not sure we want to go there. And I'm not aware, at least, of any sort of steps into that direction, that those kinds of capacities are being developed. Dapo?
No, I don't have the expertise to answer that question, so I'll defer to Alex on that.
No, well, great. Thank you both very, very much. And this